Hello, Tony, your deck architect here, back on my channel once more with another deck profile. Following up on last week's video, with the release of this year's Megatins, a ton of players have had the chance to get their hands on some of the most sought after cards of the last year, and in turn finally got the opportunity to build previously expensive decks at a much more affordable rate. Of these now budget decks, we're going to be covering one that has been highly requested in this last year. Ladies and gentlemen, today we return to the Albaz Saga another time, but instead of going forward, we're going to be going back to where it all began as we take an updated look at the Dogmatika. So the last time I covered Dogmatika, it was over a year ago as my second video on this channel. At the time, Rise of the Duelist had just hit the scene and the archetype was working with so few cards that the archetype was more of an engine than an actual deck. Since that point, however, the archetype has actually been receiving a steady wave of support every set, ultimately culminating in Lightning Overdrive with a new boss monster that drastically alters how the deck can play. And it's for this reason that I've decided to take another dive into this deck. While the deck used to play a heavy control game centered around consistent tempo and blowout traps, the modern Dogmatika takes a much more combo-oriented approach, aiming to use simple card combinations to set up progressive boards consisting of extra deck destruction and fan-favorite disruptions. And these are some of the things that I hope to explore further as I get through the deck profile. Anyway, I've droned on enough. Without a further ado, let's get into the deck profile. Starting off our deck profile, we begin by reintroducing the original lineup of Dogmatika monsters, practically unchanged from their original ratios. We have the 3 Dogmatika Ecclesia, the Virtuous, our 1 Dogmatika Aiden, the Enlightened, our 2 Dogmatika Fleur-de-Lis, the Knighted, as well as our 2 Dogmatika Maximus. To quickly reiterate the roles each card serves in the deck, we start with our Ecclesia and Aiden. Both can special summon themselves whilst the monster summoned from the X deck is on either field, and both cannot be destroyed by monsters summoned from the X deck. Ecclesia, when summoned, can add 1 Dogmatika card from your deck to your hand, acting as your basic Stratos for the deck in searching the rest of your Dogmatika support. Aiden, on the other hand, when destroyed, can summon 1 Dogmatika monster from your deck, acting as a generic floater into the rest of your Dogmatika lineup, but particularly into Ecclesia, who can then net you another Dogmatika monster. Since both have protection effects against extra deck monsters and can extend under extra deck monsters, both cards serve multifunctional purposes as either starters, extenders, or defenders as the situation requires them. Moving on to our Fleur-de-Lis, like our last 2 monsters, Fleur-de-Lis can special summon herself whilst the monster summoned from the X deck is on either field. But unlike the last 2, Fleur-de-Lis can do so on either player's main phase, and should you control a Dogmatika monster when it does so, can then negate the effects of a monster on the field. This makes Fleur-de-Lis a powerful hand trap that can be searched by your Ecclesia and can be converted directly into offense. Speaking of offense, Fleur-de-Lis also comes with a nifty effect where when a Dogmatika monster would declare an attack, Fleur-de-Lis can increase the attack of all Dogmatika monsters you control by 500. This ensures that even after hitting the field, Fleur-de-Lis impacts the game by turning basic boards into potential OTKs if left undealt with. Finally, rounding things with our Maximus, Maximus can special summon himself by banishing a Fusion, Synchro, Xyz, or Link monster from your graveyard, and once on the field, can force both players to send 2 monsters from the X deck to the graveyard. Because of its much more restrictive summoning condition, Maximus can be a brick at times. But with the advent of recent support, he also has become much more useful, as sending certain cards from your X deck into the graveyard helps immensely in setting up some of your other plays. Fortunately, with some new additions to the deck, Maximus has become a little easier to set up, but even so, it's recommended to keep it at 2 as he's not entirely necessary for a winning game state. Moving on to our only other remaining Dogmatika monster, we have our 1 White Knight of Dogmatika. Coming in at 500 attack and 2500 defense, White Knight is definitely lacking in the damage compartment, which should be a flaw but is actually a benefit that we'll cover later. Unlike other Dogmatika monsters who only lock you temporarily from your X deck, White Knight prevents you from summoning from your X deck so long as he's on the field. More importantly though, should your opponent activate a card or effect while White Knight stands guard on your field, he can send a monster from your X deck to the graveyard, to then have you look at your opponent's X deck and send one monster from theirs, to then gain the average attack of the monster sent until the end of the turn. So White Knight is a peculiar monster. Trying to describe him simplistically, White Knight is a combination of True King Lithosagem and Gale Dogra packed nicely with the Dogmatica name for theme support. Likely there will be two ways you'll be making use of him. The first and more common is that it will sit in defense position for a majority of a game, where it will trigger off your opponent doing almost anything to send a monster from both players' X deck. And this benefits you twofold. On your end, it gives you the opportunity to send cards from your X deck that have graveyard triggers to net you advantage. You could send something like a Titanclad to set up a follow-up play, or you could send an Entis for removal. On your opponent's end, you have the opportunity to send cards from their X deck that could likely ruin their plays. Because of the tight nature of today's X decks, most players commonly run one of each of their toolbox options. Being able to get in there and take out that single copy before they get a chance to use it can really limit their options and force your opponent into tricky situations. This is especially powerful against decks with restricted 1 monsters like Prank Kids or Dragon Link, where you could potentially rip out their 1 playmaker to absolutely ruin their entire combo line. And because White Knight triggers in response to your opponent making a play, it's very easy for you to extrapolate from the play their next X deck option to decisively utilize White Knight's effect to ruin them. With that being said, however, it's also important to note that in doing these actions, White Knight does gain a hefty amount of attack. This leads to our other method of playing with this card. In the off situation where your opponent interacts with you on your turn, you also have the option of sending 2 big monsters from both players' X deck to have White Knight gain enough attack to deal heavy damage to your opponent. Combined with a Fleur-de-Lis, it's very easy to have White Knight hit the 4,000 threshold to randomly go for an OTK. So if you see the window for a kill, keep this option in mind. Now in terms of ratios, we play this card as well as its ritual spell exclusively at 1. Why, you may ask? Well, it's because both are absolute bricks. While both cards are searchable by your other Dogmatica support, these two cards only interact with each other. As such, when seeing only one of these two cards, they will absolutely do nothing for you until you find a way into the other card. Thus, you want to limit the amount of copies you play such that you can search into them with your other cards, but not draw into them where they could rot in your hand. With that being said though, there actually is a lot of cool combinations to get both into your hand. Thanks to the fact that both are ritual cards, they take advantage of not only Dogmatica support, but also ritual support as well, particularly with a certain Herald that can fetch both. And what better way to make use of said Herald than with our 3 Diviner of Herald. Now you may have seen Diviner before in a lot of Drytron decks. In those decks, the goal of Diviner is to send a Herald of Arclight to trigger its effect to add a ritual card from the deck to your hand. In this deck, Diviner has a similar basic purpose, often sending Herald to help you get into one of the 2 pieces of your White Knight play. But in addition to that, there's actually a lot of other additional synergy as well. For one, while Diviner will commonly send Herald from your X deck, it's important to remember that Diviner sends any fairy from your deck or X deck. This means that Diviner can conveniently also send Entis from your X deck as well to facilitate removal. And since Diviner sends a monster from your X deck to the graveyard, he successfully puts one into the graveyard to be banished to summon out your Maximus, who could then proceed to send 2 more monsters from your X deck to the graveyard. Assuming you sent a Herald for both Maximus and Diviner, you can effectively search into both pieces of your White Knight package, making this 2-card combination a way into that play. Secondly, because Diviner clocks in at under 1000 attack points, you can always convert a normal summon Diviner into an Almirage. This puts an extra deck monster onto the field, which opens up you to special summoning your remaining Dogmatica monsters. If you special summon an Ecclesia, you can also search for a 3rd Dogmatica monster that can also special summon itself to your field, most likely a Fleur-de-Lis for Disruption. Assuming that you sent a Herald with your Diviner beforehand though, you can also search for the missing piece of your White Knight package to set up your White Knight play that way as well. Worst comes to worst, you can always link away the Almirage to make a Secure Garden beforehand, to put an additional link into the graveyard to summon a Maximus, making Diviner a card that has many flexible avenues in enabling your Dogmatica plays. Finally, rounding off our monsters with the hand traps, we have 3 Effect Veiler for effect negation, 2 Ash Blossom to block searching, as well as 2 Ghost Bell to prevent graveyard access. Outside of being powerful hand traps this format, you also play this varied ratio of each as a means of having fodder for the newly added Crossout Designator, as all 3 of these hand traps can ruin some of your biggest power plays. Going into the spells, we start with the only Dogmatika spell in the ritual spell for our White Knight, Dogmatic Calamity. Dogmatic Calamity functions mostly like any other modern ritual spell, in that it gives you the option of summoning a Dogmatika ritual monster by trading monsters from your hand or field equating to its level. Alternatively, however, you can also send a single monster from your X deck instead that fulfills that level requirement. Now, because of how crucial card advantage is for this deck, you'll almost always be using the second option of this card to summon out your White Knight. But in doing so, it essentially acts as a pseudo Nadir Servant, giving you another opportunity to send an extra deck monster for additional value. In most cases, that monster will be your Titanclad, which will trigger on the end phase to either grab you an Ecclesia or directly into your Fleur-de-Lis, effectively allowing you to put double disruptions going into your opponent's turn for a pretty effective board. Moving on from there, we expectantly have our 3 Nadir Servant. Now, given how widely played this card has been in the last year, I shouldn't have to explain what it does. But in the context of this deck, there are a few additional interactions that warrant another explanation. To put it simply, Nadir Servant sends a monster from the X deck to the graveyard to add a Dogmatika monster with less or equal attack from either the deck or graveyard. The idea is to send a monster from your X deck with a graveyard trigger, preferably one with at least 2500 attack, to add any Dogmatika monster to further your board. Powerful options for this include Titanclad for the end phase search, Entis for removal, or Omega for graveyard cycling. Additionally though, because your White Knight conveniently clocks in at 500 attack, you can also send a Herald of Arclight to search for it, of which Herald will then trigger to add you your Dogmatic Calamity, setting up your entire ritual play without any additional cards. Furthermore, it's equally important to emphasize that Nadir Servant can add from the graveyard instead of the deck. This is very important in the context of card advantage, as you may want to keep copies of cards in your deck that you hope to draw into for a long grind game, meaning that in those situations, being able to continuously cycle a single copy of a Dogmatika monster already in circulation can go a long way. Finally, wrapping up our spells, we have 3 Pot of Prosperity, a welcome upgrade from the Extravagance we were playing before. We then have the Hand Trap Hate in our 3 newly released Crossout Designator and 1 Call by the Grave. Usually I wouldn't advocate having this much Hand Trap Hate, but given how important resolving cards like the Nadir Servant or Ecclesia are, you do want to play as many as possible options to ensure that they go through past hand traps. Finally, rounding things off with the traps, we have a simple package consisting of 3 Dogmatika Punishment, 3 Infinite Impermanence, 2 Trap Trick, as well as 2 Rivalry of the Warlords. To give a quick explanation for each, Punishment acts as powerful removal from the deck. Clearing most monsters will allow you to send a Titanclad or Entis for additional value. Impermanence is just basic effect negation, played at 3 to also be used as crossout fodder. Trap Trick allows you to get into either to respond to the situation at hand. And Rivalry wins you games. Because a majority of this deck is predominantly spellcasters, but a majority of the meta is multi-type, Rivalry can easily lock most of your opponents out of their best plays. A limitation made more powerful when backed by a White Knight to rip out remaining valid options in your opponent's X deck that your opponent might have. Then, rounding off this deck profile with the X deck, we have 2 groups of monsters. The first is the monsters we'll be sending for cards like Nadir Servant and Dogmatic Calamity. These cards are cards we will never summon but have fantastic effects when sent to the graveyard. These include 3 Titanclad for the end phase search or special, 2 Elder Entity Entis for destroying cards on the field, 3 Herald of Arclight to search into our ritual plays, 1 Psyframe Lord Omega to shuffle back graveyard cards, 1 Fairjeet the Barren Blossom for an emergency cycle, 1 Wind Pegasus Adagnister for a responsive play against aggression, and 1 5-headed Link Dragon for when we need to destroy a big monster with punishment. Then going on to the second group are monsters we will actually be making, of which there are only 3. 2 Almirage to link our Diviner of Herald into, and 1 Secure Garna to link Almirage into to put it into the graveyard. Now it's at this point that we once again reach the combo component of our deck profile. However, Dogmatika isn't exactly a deck known for having complex combos. In most situations, the deck aims to end on very simplistic boards of a White Knight on field, maybe a few traps set, and some hand traps primed. With that being said, this combo component isn't necessarily dedicated to explaining how you would build your board, but more to how you would play with your built board. Because of the nature of White Knight's ability to rip apart extra decks, your use of him and the disruptions you have available differs depending on the matchup. As such, I'll be working with a single test hand today, building a board with it, and then explaining how you would play with said board against a variety of meta decks. Anyway, the deck is shuffled, the board is ready, let us begin. So, drawing out our one and only test hand, the hand we're going to be working with today consists of 1 Diviner of Herald, 2 Diviner of Herald, 1 Dogmatika Ecclesia, 1 White Knight of Dogmatika, and 1 Rivalry of the Warlord. It's hard to gauge how good this hand can be. On one hand, we did brick with double Diviner. On the other, opening Ecclesia and Diviner ensures we have a way to stick our White Knight. So let's see how this plays out. I'm going to start by normal summoning out my Diviner and then activating its effect to go into my extra deck and send a Herald of Arclight to the graveyard. In doing so, Herald of Arclight will then trigger, allowing me to grab the next piece of my Dogmatika package. Now, before I actually activate Dogmatika Calamity, I'm then going to link away the Diviner of Herald to summon out my Almirage. The reason for this is because when I activate my Dogmatika Calamity, for the rest of the turn after this resolves and when White Knight hits the field, I won't be able to access the extra deck. So this is the last opportunity for me to do so. But before I do that, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to actually special summon out the Ecclesia since I control a monster summon from the extra deck, activating Ecclesia's effect to grab a Dogmatika Punishment. From there, I'm then going to activate the Dogmatika Calamity, going back into my extra deck once more and sending a Titanclad to summon out my White Knight to the field. From there, I'm then going to set the Dogmatika Punishment as well as the Rivalry of the Warlords, and then go to my end phase, of which Titanclad will then trigger, to then allow me to grab a Fleur-de-Lis, of which I then pass turn to my opponent. Now, going into our opponent's turn, let's do a quick head count here. In terms of disruption, we have 3 things. The first is a punishment, which can technically send an Entis for 2 waves of removal. Next, we have a Fleur-de-Lis in hand that we can special summon while we control the Almirage to negate a monster effect since we control both Ecclesia and White Knight. Speaking of White Knight, we also have our main enforcer in the White Knight of Dogmatika on the field, being able to not only rip apart our opponent's extra deck, but also send another Entis for another wave of removal. Backing all this up is the Rivalry of Warlords, which itself can lock out a number of matchups. Now, having established all that, we now move on to how we would utilize these cards against certain matchups. Starting with the most favorable matchups, suppose you were playing a Prank Kids or a Dragon Link player. You know both of these decks currently have access to only one copy of their Link 1 monster. As such, you want to force your opponent into a situation where they would have to activate an effect so that you can then use your White Knight to rip that Link 1 out. As such, it is in your best interest to punishment their normal summon, as doing so forces your opponent to either respond with a card effect or extend with a card effect to further play, which in turn triggers our White Knight to send their Link 1, send an Entis to pop their extender, and then quickly finish the game from there with our Fleur-de-Lis and Rivalry. Now suppose instead you were playing a Tri-Brigade player. Because all the Tri-Brigade links trigger when they're sent to the graveyard, sending any of them to the graveyard for White Knight's effect could prove disastrous. As such, your targets for White Knight's effect instead shifts to their toolbox options, with cards like Appaloosa, Access Code, and Dragon Lords. Regardless though, the way you would deal with this deck is almost the same. When they normal summon something like a Rescue Cat or another Tri-Brigade monster, punishment that monster. Doing so forces your opponent to have a Kurass or bust. Now suppose they do, however, since Kurass activates the minute it hits the field, White Knight can trigger to send an Entis to pop Kurass and potentially end their turn. Alternatively, you could use the Fleur-de-Lis to negate the Kurass, and instead of sending Entis for White Knight's effect, send another Titanclad for a follow-up play instead. Now the difficult one, however, will be when it comes to playing around Drytron. Because Drytron often plays without their normal summon, removing their one normal summon seldom outs their plays. However, Drytron also have 2 very easily telegraphed paths to play. The first and most common is the Ultimateness line. This line aims to make both Herald of Ultimateness and a Beatrice Lady of the Eternal to load up the hand with 3 to 4 fairies. However, when it comes to making this board, your opponent will have to activate Meteonis Drytron to summon out a level 6 ritual to make the Beatrice. That activation alone telegraphs the Beatrice, but also allows us to trigger our White Knight to then take said limited Beatrice out of their extra deck. This forces our opponent to make an alternative rank 6, which at that point telegraphs Drytron's other path of play, the Zeus. In this situation, you have two options. The first is that you can send an Entis with White Knight to pop one of their level 6s, preferably the Ritual, to prevent them from making the Xyz. The other is to simply punish with the Xyz when it comes out, sending an Entis to remove any other Xyz before it battles. And even if they were to have the Herald of Ultimateness to negate either, don't forget that you have a Fleur-de-Lis in hand to negate said Ultimateness, forcing your opponent to have that perfect hand of double Fairy beforehand to out your board. And that's going to do it for our updated Dogmatika deck profile. So what are my thoughts on the deck? Well, because of cards like Dogmatika Ecclesia and Nadir's Servant, the deck is incredibly consistent at getting the cards it needs. But in terms of power, the deck is lacking. While cards like Fleur-de-Lis and White Knight do very unfair things, they also don't do them as unconditionally as Omni-Negates like Herald of Ultimateness or Appaloosa. As such, the deck is incredibly matchup dependent at times. But that perhaps is why Dogmatika is still played as an engine instead of its own deck. Still, if you want to feel the true righteousness of an anti-X-Deck deck, I'd say that this is the deck for you. Regardless, this has been Tony, your deck architect, with an updated Dogmatika deck profile. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next time.